They say justice is blind, but perhaps that is only because she cannot bear to look power in the eye. Before the blood, before the siege towers, before the quiet annihilation of an island named Melos, there was a story, a beautiful one. It spoke of fairness, of moral order, of a world where the weak might speak and still be heard. This story was told by temples and inscribed on laws. It was repeated by philosophers and echoed in the hearts of free men. It is the myth of justice, not as a tool of rulers, but as the soul of civilization. Athens once worshipped this myth. She, the city of thinkers and orators, once claimed to be its birthplace. The city that praised reason, that birthed democracy, that put Socrates on trial for corrupting the youth with questions of virtue. And yet, as history would soon show, Athens was also the city that raised Melos, not out of vengeance, not even out of necessity, but out of cold logic. A decision weighed on scales that had no space for morality. Melos was small, neutral, and unarmed. It offered no immediate threat, no insult. It only made one mistake. It wanted to remain free. It believed that neutrality was a moral position, that the gods might intervene, that Sparta might come, that being just would count for something in the final calculation. Athens disagreed, and so began a conversation unlike any other in the history of war. A dialogue that has outlived empires, a negotiation that was, from the first word, a sentence. But not only for Melos. For all who believed that justice was something more than a polite fiction among equals. This is not a tale of conquest. It is a tale of what happens when realism meets the soul of myth and wins. Every empire needs a story, not just to justify its conquests, but to believe in itself. For Athens, that story was justice, refined by philosophy, elevated by democracy, adorned with the golden words of orators and playwrights. It was a city that saw itself not merely as powerful, but as right. To understand how the myth was born, we must begin not with swords, but syllables, with Plato's dialogues and Pericles' funeral oration, with the belief that Athenian strength was not brute force, but enlightened leadership, that their empire was not oppression, but tutelage. Athens did not conquer, it civilized. So the myth took root, that power, when held by the rational and the cultured, could be just, that might, if cloaked in logos, transformed into moral right. The Delian League, formed to protect the Greek world from Persia, gradually morphed into an Athenian empire, but the narrative endured. Athens was not expanding for greed, they told themselves, but to spread harmony, reason, and law. Meanwhile, Melos sat apart, a small Dorian island that refused to take sides. In the Peloponnesian War, neutrality was a dangerous position. It was interpreted not as peacekeeping, but as quiet rebellion. To Athens, Melos was not innocent. It was inconvenient, not threatening, but uncooperative. Yet the myth persisted. Athens still saw itself as a beacon. Its citizens recited the names of philosophers like incantations. They debated ethics even as they sharpened their spears. They could not see that their justice had become selective, conditional, only extended to those who submitted. Melos became a mirror. It reflected a contradiction Athens could not bear, a place that believed in the same gods, in the same language, in the same Hellenic world, but refused to kneel. If Athens was truly the guardian of justice, then why must Melos be destroyed? The myth had no answer, only policy did. And so the birth of the myth was not merely a tale of high ideals, it was also the beginning of its unraveling. For any myth that cannot withstand contradiction will, in time, be killed by it. No war drums, no trumpet calls. The Melian Dialogue opens not with clash, but with calm. It is a meeting, not a battlefield, and that makes it more terrifying. Two delegations, one small, quiet, desperate, the other confident, measured, already victorious in posture. But this is no ordinary parley. There is no real negotiation, no give and take. The outcome is predetermined, and both sides know it. What unfolds is not diplomacy. It is ritual, a performance, a political autopsy. The dialogue is stripped of names. No generals, no faces, no tears. Only roles, the strong and the weak, the powerful and the pleading. It is the abstraction of politics in its purest, most chilling form, like a tragedy where the actors have been replaced by ideas. This is what makes the dialogue timeless. It is not about Athens and Melos. It is about the architecture of dominance, about how logic, when wielded by power, can become more lethal than any weapon. The Melians speak of gods, of hope, of allies. The Athenians speak only of outcomes. In this sterile room of reason, morality is exiled. Even compassion is considered naive. The Melian pleas are answered with analysis. The Melian hopes with probabilities. The Melian soul with silence. And so the stage is set, not for a battle of arms, but for a dismantling of myth. The real tragedy is that both sides speak clearly, and yet there is no bridge between them. One speaks in values, the other in variables. It is not a misunderstanding, it is an incompatibility, a meeting of two worldviews that cannot coexist, and as the curtain rises, the audience already knows the ending. That is what makes it tragic, and that is what makes it real. It is a quiet demolition. No swords are drawn, no blood is spilled, but a world dies the moment the Athenians speak. You know as well as we do that justice is only relevant between equals in power. As for the rest, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. It is not just a statement, it is an execution of every story that began with, "Once upon a time the just prevailed." The Athenians do not shout, they do not threaten, they do something worse. They reason, with perfect clarity, with dispassionate arithmetic, and in doing so they shatter the illusion that the world listens to anything other than force. In that moment, the mask slips, not just from Athens, but from history itself. Realism steps forward, naked and unapologetic. Power is not clothed in morality, it is not even veiled in necessity. It is simply used like a tool, like fire. The Athenians are not cruel, they are cold. There is a difference, and it is more frightening. Cruelty is emotional. Coldness is structural. It cannot be swayed by pity, by poetry, by prayer. It listens only to what increases leverage. The Melians speak of justice, and Athens calls it irrelevant. The Melians speak of hope, and Athens calls it costly. The Melians speak of honor, and Athens calls it foolish. Every appeal is met not with mockery, but with indifference. It is not scorn that kills ideals, it is irrelevance. This is realism's first and most devastating blow. It redefines truth, not as something moral or eternal, but as something measurable, tangible, strategic. If you cannot back your justice with spears, it is not justice, it is fantasy. And in the Athenian gaze, that fantasy has no place, no weight, no future. Thus begins the quiet murder of the soul. And yet they answered. In the face of overwhelming force, the Melians did not scream or kneel. They spoke, measured, principled, and calm. Their words, though fragile against the might of empire, rang with the conviction of something ancient, older than Athens, older even than politics. Faith. They appealed to the gods, not as a tactic, but as a truth. That divine justice watches all, and those who act with hubris will, in time, be struck down. That the moral arc of the universe bends toward retribution. that history punishes the arrogant. To the Athenians, such talk was sentimental, a luxury for those who had nothing else. But to the Melians it was armor, not of bronze, but of belief. They had no fleet, no army, but they had the stubborn dignity of those who refused to let the world be rewritten by force alone. They spoke of alliances, that Sparta might come, that their fellow Dorians would not stand idle, that kinship might awaken obligation, that shared blood still meant something in a time of brutal calculus. Athens listened and dismissed it all. Then came the most haunting appeal of all, hope. The Melians did not deny their weakness, but they insisted that hope had its own kind of power, that not all outcomes can be predicted, that the future was not yet written, that history sometimes turns in favor of those who endure. The Athenian reply was surgical. Hope is by nature an expensive commodity, and those who invest in it when they are not strong often find themselves bankrupt. It was not anger, it was accounting. To Athens, hope without strength was a lie. Faith without force was folly. Honor without outcome was suicide. But to Melos, surrender would mean something worse, the death of meaning itself. They would rather fall with their myth intact than live by the terms of a world stripped of soul. And so Melos did not yield. They chose the myth. They chose to believe that justice could still mean something, even in the presence of a sword pressed against the neck. They chose to believe that the gods see, that history remembers, that even if they fell, they would not fall alone. But history, at least in that moment, belonged to Athens, and the Athenians, unmoved, prepared the final act. It ended not with fire, but with silence. After the dialogue, there were no more words, only execution. The men of Melos were slaughtered, the women and children sold into slavery, the island repopulated by Athenian settlers. What remained of Melos was not a people, but a possession. And with that, a world view died. The real casualty was not a city, it was a story. A way of believing that justice exists independently of strength, that small voices matter, that morality can defy force and still survive. This belief, fragile and stubborn, had lived for centuries, in temples, in laws, in hearts. Melos was its last expression and its tomb. When the myth dies in private, it becomes a personal grief, but when it dies in public, it becomes instruction. Athens taught the world a lesson that day, not in theory, but in theater. They did not just win a war, they staged a demonstration. They showed what happens when ideals are confronted by realism, and realism is allowed to decide what is real. And yet, the horror of Melos is not in its cruelty, it is in its logic. No madness, no chaos, just conclusions, delivered step by step as if each were perfectly rational. Because they were. This is how souls are killed, not with swords but with sentences. And still, something lingers. Not in the bodies, but in the silence that followed, in the echo of the words once spoken, in the awareness that something sacred had been stripped and shattered, not accidentally, but methodically. What died in Melos was not hope. Hope can be rekindled, it was meaning. And when meaning dies, the soul follows. This is the unbearable part. The Athenians were not entirely wrong. Their words cut deeply, not because they were lies, but because they were true, in the coldest, most functional sense of truth. Power does not ask permission. History is not written by those who are right, but by those who survive. Justice, in the mouths of the powerless, often sounds like wishful thinking to those who hold the sword. Realism is seductive because it works. It demands no belief, only observation. It does not require that we like the world, only that we understand it. And once we do, we can act effectively. Realism is not a dream, it is a manual. a system of navigation through a sea where moral compasses only spin. The Athenians were not monsters. They were technicians of power. Their decisions were not emotional. They were strategic. In their minds, sparing Melos would have been irresponsible, a show of softness that could invite rebellion from others. Their cruelty was preventive, their dominance efficient. This is the horror, that realism, when viewed from within, does not feel evil. It feels responsible. And so we ask, is Athens wrong? Or are we simply uncomfortable with what Athens reveals? Perhaps that is the true power of Thucydides. He does not give us villains. He gives us mirrors. And in Athens we see ourselves, not always as we wish to be, but as we often are when we make decisions in fear, in ambition, in cold necessity. What makes the Melian Dialogue haunting is not its brutality, it is its clarity. And clarity, when untempered by conscience, becomes the sharpest blade of all. We speak of myths as lies we outgrow, but what if they are the lies we need? Melos believed in justice and died. Athens believed in power and fell. So who was right? The truth may be that both were wrong, but for opposite reasons. Melos clung too tightly to a dream. Athens discarded it too quickly for results. And perhaps civilizations do not fall because they dream or because they scheme, but because they forget why they began to speak at all. What if myth is not a childish illusion, but a necessary lens? Not because it is factually true, but because it provides the moral gravity that realism alone cannot generate. We tell stories of justice so that we do not forget the difference between victory and virtue. We speak of cheese, of honor, of duty, because without them all actions become transactions, and all people become means. Athens, in its precision, lost its poetry. Melos, in its devotion, lost its pragmatism. And between them, something broke, a bridge, a voice, a future. In modern times, we still argue between realism and idealism, between what is and what should be. But we rarely ask, what holds them together? Myth does. It is the thread that weaves the real into the meaningful. It is the quiet assertion that even if we do not always win by moral standards, we must still measure ourselves by them. Without myth, power becomes not only possible, it becomes permissible. Realism without restraint becomes savagery wearing a suit. And so we return to the question, should Melos have yielded? Should Athens have spared them? The answer, perhaps, matters less than the fact that we still ask, that we still care, that somewhere inside us the myth has not died. Because if it ever does, if we no longer even pretend that justice matters, then the world may indeed survive, but it will no longer mean anything worth surviving for. Melos was wiped from the map, but not from memory. Athens won the island. It lost the future. Within a generation, it too would fall, battered by war, hubris, and the slow erosion of its moral center. Sparta did not bring down Athens. Athens did, piece by piece, word by word. But even as both cities crumbled, the dialogue remained. Thucydides, a man exiled by his own people, wrote not to glorify victory, but to expose its anatomy. He preserved not the names of the negotiators, but the structure of their logic, not their bloodlines, but their sentences. And in doing so, he ensured that Melos, though physically erased, would haunt the conscience of political thought forever. Melos survives not in territory, but in text. It survives as a question carved into the architecture of power. What does it mean to win? And what exactly is lost in the process? Athens, for all its triumphs, became a symbol of the fatal seduction of dominance. Melos, for all its defeat, became the martyr of moral resistance. In that reversal lies the enduring power of narrative. The powerless, once destroyed, become the powerful in memory. History did not forget Melos. It could not, because Thucydides did not let it. And so, in every generation since, the dialogue is replayed in diplomacy, in war rooms, in university lectures, in backdoor negotiations. Two voices, two visions, one fading, one rising, and always the question hovering: which voice do we trust? Which cost are we willing to pay? Empires rise and fall. The strong do what they can. The weak suffer what they must. But it is the story that endures. And Melos, silent as it became, still speaks in the margins of power. Perhaps we are all Athenians now. We speak in metrics, in projections, in strategies and safeguards. We weigh cost against risk, not right against wrong. We call this wisdom, but sometimes it is only weariness of believing in things we can no longer afford to defend. And yet, Melos lingers, not as a city, not even as a cause, but as a whisper, a reminder that power is never just a tool. It is a test, a mirror, and that each time we use it, we must ask, what part of our soul are we willing to trade for the outcome? The Melian Dialogue does not end with a lesson. It ends with silence. But perhaps that is the point, that the deepest truths are not shouted but buried, waiting for someone to ask again. We live in a world that rewards realism, but we dream in myths. And maybe, just maybe, to be human is to live in that impossible tension. So the question remains, unanswered, unfinished. If we give up the myth entirely, who will we become? And will we recognize what's left?